So let's get into today's topic. Let's dive into what we're really here to discuss. This is a topic very close to my heart. As you guys have seen, my family is kind of a one household rebellion against the philosophy of survival of the fittest. So this is very personal to me. And that's what this issue is really about. Our conversation today is not science versus religion, because there are scientists and religious people on both sides of this conversation. Our conversation today is not about a culture war. Our conversation today is not about some arcane secondary issue of deep science. What our conversation about today really is about the dignity of life, about whether there is a purpose or meaning to our existence. It's about where we come from. It's about why we're here. It's about purpose. It's about finding our place in the universe if we have one. That's what this conversation is really about. And this is our starting point, or this is at least my starting point. See, the Bible teaches us that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. According to the Bible, if the Bible is true, if Christianity is true, then we should be able to look out at the world around us and see clear and evident and present evidence that God has placed in creation that points back to himself and that shows us that he is there. What I hope to show you guys is that that is what we do see. The Bible does not exaggerate when it says that we are with excuse. And this isn't a new conversation in the modern world. Obviously, I could go. Hello? There we go. I could go back to ancient authors, but just from a modern standpoint, one of the most famous figures that has framed this conversation and shaped the way we still talk and think about it today was a man named William Paley. Anyone ever heard the name William Paley before? That's okay. That's okay. But you live in the shadow of his work. In 1802, he published a book called Natural Theology. And if you want to get to sleep tonight, grab a copy of it. But the first page of that book, the first few paragraphs, contain an illustration that still shapes the way we have this conversation to this day. I dare say the entire creation evolution discussion exists in the shadow of Pele's watch. You see, in the first few paragraphs, he presented an illustration that goes something like this. Imagine that you are walking down a trail in the mountain, and you look down and you see a rock on the ground. Just pick any one of those rocks. You're looking at that rock and you're asking, why is this here? Now, you might assume any number of things. Maybe it formed right there and then stuff eroded around it and left it sitting there. Maybe it broke off a larger rock up the mountain and tumbled down. For all you know, it's been sitting there since the world began. But most of the explanations you would jump to would not involve someone purposefully putting that specific rock in that exact place. You would not necessarily see a design in that particular rock. But imagine instead that's what you find on the trail. If that's what you found on the trail, what conclusions would you come to? You would pick up this pocket watch and you would see all of its complex arrangement of finely tuned parts that are all fit together in a specific way that makes it function with purpose. And when you see that, you immediately know without question. You don't have to think about it. You know someone made this. Someone built this thing. Now, let's say you've never heard of a watch before and you know nothing about timekeeping. You would still look at this and come to the same conclusion, even if you're not sure what it's doing. You would look at it and see all these parts working together in this detailed, specific way to do something, and you would say, someone made this. I know someone made this. You'd have no question about that. And so William Paley argued that when we look around at the grand outworking of the cosmos, or how the environments of our planet work, like the water cycle, or most specifically, he spends the majority of his book talking about living things, biology. But when we look at all of this, we see something that we can identify as designed the same way that we identify the watch. Now, to be clear, Pele was not saying that living things are like watches, that we're just machines made out of meat. That was not his point. His point was that the same way that we can look at a watch and determine its design, we can use that same method to look at living things or all the laws of nature and the cosmos itself, everything in between, and we will see the same features that point to a designer. And this was very persuasive to people of that day. And in fact, the theory of evolution, as publicized originally by Charles Darwin, took hold in part because of this conversation about Pele's watch. It's not that the theory wouldn't have been thought of anyway, but that it had the significance in the culture that it did because of this conversation. So what is the theory of evolution? When we talk about evolution, that word simply means, change over time. But when we're talking about evolution in biology, that's not what we mean. Everyone agrees that living things change over time. That's not what the theory is. Evolution is shorthand for the theory of biological evolution by the means of natural selection. So there's three components to this, and all three of them have to be in place for this to be Darwinian evolution. First of all, that all living things living ancestor. I know it went out, that's why I'm projecting a little out. There we go. Hello? Okay. All right. So, first of all, is the idea that every single living organism on the earth, according to this theory, all descend from one common ancestor, one small single-celled bacterium of sorts, that its offspring were a little different than itself, and their offspring were a little different than themselves, and all this variation comes up, and it eventually leads to all the different living things we have today. So yourself, a coconut tree, a cactus, a crocodile, a bald eagle, a fungus, all come from the same original being. So common descent. The second point, well, how did this happen? Common descent is by random variation acted upon through natural selection. All that means is, again, my kids look different than me, and their kids will look different than them. And there's slight change with every generation of reproduction. And so you have all this random variation happening. Each generation looks a little different. And then natural selection acts on that variation and says, which one is best suited to survive in this environment? So if you're in a cold environment, some are born with long hair and some are born with short hair. Which ones are going to die out? Short hair. Now, it's a simple version, There's obviously much more complex versions than this, but the idea is that of all these variations, naturally, without anyone having to plan it or do anything about it, just naturally, the variations that are most suited for a particular environment are the ones that are going to survive and the ones that are going to reproduce and pass on their genes. And so in any given environment, slowly over time, things are going to become more and more suited for that environment because only the right variations survive. So that's random variation acted on by natural selection, which then the third point, that this is an entirely unguided, unplanned, blind, purposeless process. It's just what happens. No one is acting on it to make it happen, to make certain types of organisms succeed and other ones fail. It is purely just natural law. It's just happening. Now, this theory, Charles Darwin arrived at it because he really believed it. He really thought the evidence was pointing that way. So I don't want to make it like he just conspired to make something up to win an argument. But the reason why he thought the theory was so important, why he thought it was so significant, is because he believed that through this process, he could eliminate the watchmaker. You could have watches without watchmakers. So Charles Darwin once wrote, "The old argument of design in nature as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, falls now that the law of natural selection has been discovered." This was the point. He had found a way to get rid of the designer. You could have design without a designer. You could have contrivance without a contriver, engineering without an engineer. This was the point he believed he had discovered. And this is still what frames the conversation today. Anyone heard the name Richard Dawkins before? Most famous evolutionary biologist in the world today. His first most popular book was The Blind Watchmaker. We still haven't escaped Pele yet. This is still framing the conversation. The Blind Watchmaker, subtitle, Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that everyone who believes in evolution thinks this way. There are plenty of people who believe in evolution and believe in a God. What I am saying is that the main driving voices behind this theory from the beginning, even though they were convinced by evidence, they latched onto the theory and promoted it passionately. It was important to them because what they believed it could do. They believed ultimately that it could get them not just out of Pele, but out of Paul. That they could escape Romans 1. That they were not indeed without excuse. Richard Dawkins once wrote that after Darwin, one could finally be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. There were atheists before Darwin, but there were still too many questions for it to be a fulfilling position. But Dawkins revels in the fact that he believes that Darwin allows one to be intellectually fulfilled in the position of atheism. They think they found an escape hatch from the evidence of a grand designer. They think they've made it out of Romans 1, but they have not. There's an old joke that in the near future, a group of scientists finally, through quantum physics, microbiology, and organic chemistry, figure out the very secret of life. In fact, they can take the molecules of dirt and dust and rearrange them so that in a laboratory, they can create a living human embryo. They can make man from the dust of the earth. And so these scientists, remember this is a fictional joke, these scientists go into the throne room of God and they stand before him and say, God, thank you for all you did getting things started, but we've got it from here. We ourselves can now make man from dust. And God looks down and smiles and says, okay, show me. So they stoop down and begin to scoop up the dirt on the ground beneath them. And God goes, whoa, 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 what are you doing? We're getting dust. Huh, you're doing this without me. Get your own dust. It's funny, but this is exactly what our scientists are doing today, or those who profess that God is unnecessary, is that they're building their theory without even realizing it out of God's dust. They're still borrowing from a God-saturated world, even to build a theory that denies him. So what kind of world is necessary for the theory of evolution to be true? Before we're even talking about whether it's true, let's just, for the sake of argument, let's say it really happened, that this theory is really describing reality. What type of world would that have to be? Well, it would have to be a rational world governed by consistent law-like order. This whole thing is built on these iron, inescapable natural laws that govern every part of the universe. That everything in the world operates a very specific, reasonable, consistent, unchanging way. The world absolutely logically does not have to work that way, but it does. And it's necessary for it to, if their theory is going to get off the ground. Secondly, it has to be a meaningful world. That order has to be discoverable. It has to be coherent, expressible, knowable, or you can't build the theory. What else has to be true? It has to be purposeful. The laws of nature could be a lot of different things. We have a specific set of laws that could be different than they are, but they have to be exactly the way they are for life to exist. You can't have a Charles Darwin or a Richard Dawkins if you have a universe where life isn't possible. They're depending on a world in which the strength of gravity is exactly what it is, because if it were stronger or weaker, life couldn't exist. All sorts of laws are like this. Also, where everything's put in the right spot. If our planet was moved by only a few degrees, the temperatures would be unlivable. If liquid water if water did not exist as solid, liquid, and gas in the narrow temperature range that we live in, no other major fluid does that. That's weird, by the way. And yet water does. The one substance that we need to be able to do that, to have a water cycle, for our sweat to be able to cool us, for our bodies to be able to function. Every single thing about the universe could be different than it is, but it's hardwired in a very specific way. Our planet is around the right type of star, in the right type of galaxy, on the right position in that galaxy, and has the right substances on it for life to exist. It's amazing. It didn't need to be that way. The universe also has to be scientific. We have to be able to understand through observation and experiment how this law-like order works to be able to build scientific theories at all. Don't take my word for all of this. Anyone ever heard of Albert Einstein? Yeah, pretty smart guy, I've heard. He said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. This is the biggest mystery of all, the fact that some things aren't mysteries, that we can actually figure out the way any of the universe works. It's mind-blowing. Way back even before the time of the New Testament, Cicero, the great Roman statesman and scholar, he observed, if the first sight of the universe happened to throw the scholars into confusion, once they observed its measured, steady movements and noted that all its parts were governed by established order and unchangeable regularity, they ought to have realized that in this divine dwelling in the heavens was one who was not merely a resident, but a ruler, controller, and so to say, the architect of this great structural project. But as things stand, they seem to harbor not even a suspicion of the immense marvels of sky and earth. Now remember, this is a Roman polytheist. This is a pagan who believes in many gods, and yet he looks out in the universe, he says, if you just look at the way the universe works, its regular order, there must be one God who is above all gods, who doesn't just live in the heavens, he made the heavens, and he tells them what to do. He could see, just by looking at the world around him, that there was this one ultimate God. behind it all. That's amazing, isn't it? And how did he see it? Through this rational, intelligible, law-like order that governs our universe. The agnostic astronomer Fred Hoyle said a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Now, he, as an agnostic, goes on to argue that that common sense interpretation is not necessarily right, but he acknowledges that it is the common sense way to look at the order of the scientific world that we live in. Atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel, we'll talk more about him later. But he wrote, science is driven by the assumption that the world is intelligible. That is, the world in which we find ourselves and about which experience gives us some information can be not only described, but understood. That assumption is behind every pursuit of knowledge, including pursuits that end in illusion. So even if you build the wrong theory, you still have to assume this order to get there, whether your theory is right or wrong. He goes on. In the natural sciences, as they have developed since the 17th century, the assumption of intelligibility has led to extraordinary discoveries, confirmed by prediction and experiment, of a hidden natural order that cannot be observed by human perception alone. Without the assumption of an intelligible underlying order, which long antedates the scientific revolution, those discoveries could not have been made. Of course, Pele could have already told you all this. In fact, he did, but everyone fell asleep before they got to that part of his book. So, Pele wrote, it is a perversion of language to assign any laws as the efficient and operative cause of anything. I told you, you just got to suffer through it. But a law presupposes an agent, for it is only the mode according to which an agent proceeds. It implies a power, for it is the order according to which that power acts. Without this agent, without this power, which are both distinct from itself, the law does nothing, is nothing. In other words, scientific laws of physics, laws of chemistry, these are only describing an order that's already there that is separate from the law itself. Laws don't make things happen in science. They describe what we already see happen. They're describing an order that's already built into the world around us, and we have to assume that the world works like that to even begin doing science. Rabbi Haim H. Donen said, to ascribe the precise functioning of the universe and all the amazing wonders of life to nature is only to resort to a synonym for the natural laws that beg for explanation. The mystery remains. So, here we see the borrowing of God's dirt. You have to start off with a universe that operates in a rational, reasonable way, a way that itself seems to be built on a mind. In fact, the way it operates is not only reasonable and consistent and law-like, but it is so easily described. Once we discover something about the universe, it always works in a way that fits into a nice, neat equation or law. This is the only reason science is possible. So it's almost as if the world not only works according to a mind that governs it, but it works the way you would expect it to if God literally spoke it into existence. In fact, I think I read that somewhere. So we see in the grand cosmos in which this theory has to operate, a cosmos that is utterly dependent on the mind of God behind it, and that people have seen this for centuries. And the evolutionary theory doesn't debate this. It assumes this order to even get started. But what about life itself? Evolution does not explain the origin of life. It explains what happens when you already have life. But what is life? Well, the thing about life is that every living thing in the world, the way that life functions is built on information. Down in every cell, we have a set of instructions known as DNA. It is a digital code that gives instructions for how the cell is to build itself by manufacturing molecular machines that then generate the various portions of the cell and then build more so that it can duplicate itself. And then on the outside of each of those cells, it is information-rich carbohydrates on the outer membrane that allow those cells to communicate with each other and work together to become tissues and to build an organism and to function together. Even our immune system operates by these cells being able to essentially talk to each other through these outer molecules, rich in linguistic type information, not exactly language, but very like that in the way that it works. Not only that, we've more recently discovered what's called epigenetics. Anyone ever heard the term epigenetics before? A few of you. Epigenetics is a system that then looks at those instructions, the genome and our DNA, and reacts to them in different ways depending on the environment, so that basically our cells are able to turn genes on and off depending on what's going on in our life and which ones we need at the moment, and not just on and off like a light switch, but more like a dimmer switch. They can change the intensity of the expression of a particular set of instructions depending on what our body needs at the moment. And some of this epigenetic information can even be passed on to the next generation. So we've got information to tell us how to read the information, that tells us how to build the other information, that then guides the information carrying cells to react with the other information so that our bodies can work at every moment. And this isn't just any information. This is what's called specified complexity. It is complex information that specifies a function. It's a code. And we know only one source in the entire observable universe. We're going to be scientists here. We're going to look at what causes exist that can do things, right? Well, there's only one cause in the whole universe that can produce this kind of information. A mind. A mind. And so when we look at what life is, we see that life, by definition, is operating by a set of coded instructions, a kind of information that can only come from a mental source, a conscious, intentional, purposeful being. So again, before we even get started with discussing the theory of evolution, on multiple levels, this theory is built on the idea of a God-saturated universe. Information at every level, from the molecule to the cell, to the tissue, to the organ, to the system, to the body, everything. We don't have time to go into the rest of the origin of life topic. It is a big one, but that would have to be its own talk another time. So I will let physiologist J. Scott Turner kind of sum up where we are in secular biological science on this subject, and we can move on. We don't have a good Darwinian explanation for the origin of life. Part of the reason for this is that we don't have a good Darwinian explanation for what life is in the first place. Nor do we have a good explanation for the origin and evolution of the cornerstone of the edifice of modern Darwinism, the gene. If that weren't enough, Darwinism is having a rather hard time explaining what an organism is, or why it seems to tend toward, or why life seems to tend towards organism-like assemblages, or why living things are actually, not apparently, well designed. So let's latch on to this last detail here, that when we look at living things, they are in fact well designed. No, none other than Richard Dawkins himself says, biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed with a purpose. Now, he argues that it's only an appearance. That's not really what living things are. But what he does acknowledge is that when you look at living things, they sure look like they were designed with a purpose.
They've got the signs of it all over them, but because of Darwinism, we know they must not be. So let's ask, how do we detect design? So if we're going to answer this question, is it only the appearance of a design or is it really design? How do we detect design? Well, it takes us back to Paley's watch again, right? Once again, one way that we detect design is when we see a coordinated arrangement of various parts in such a way that they perform together a function. We see a mark of design. Now, there are plenty of design things that don't fit that description, very simple design things that don't have parts, that aren't coordinated together, yet we know people made them. But this is one way we can detect design. But there's a simpler way. And here we get into the research of a man named William Dembski. I want to give his name because I'm even stealing his illustration. I don't like to plagiarize, so I'm giving him credit, but I'm still going to steal from him. So here we go. So Dembski did a research in how do we detect design? What filter do our minds use to see what's designed and what's not designed? And here's the example he uses. Anyone here play poker? You can admit it. Come on. No one's judging you here. All right, a few of you. So tell me, if I'm the dealer and I deal a set of cards and I end up dealing myself this hand, am I going to have a good game? Now, let's say I continue dealing and I deal for 3 hands, and each time I end up with this exact same hand. Now, what are you going to think about me? That I am the most unlucky person in the face of the earth, that I keep getting this. The chances are astronomical, but you're probably not going to suspect a plot because that would be a weird thing for me to do to myself. But let's say same scenario. And that's the hand I keep getting. If we're in the Wild West, I just got shot. You know I'm cheating. You don't just think I'm cheating. If every time I deal, I get this hand, you know I'm cheating. Design detected. How? This hand is not made up of a bunch of different integrated parts like a watch. Yet we see design in the fact that when I'm dealing, I get this hand. There's a plot. How? Well, 2 factors. First, it's astronomically unlikely to happen. But the thing is, so is that. In fact, the chances of getting this hand 3 times in a row and this hand 3 times in a row are identical. Statistically, they're the same. And so the rarity of the event, how implausible it is only part of the filter. The other part, it has to be extremely unlikely and it has to conform to a pattern or function. If we see this is really unlikely to happen on its own and it does something, it conforms to a pattern or a function, there's a purpose in it, then we detect design. And we all do this all the time without even thinking about it. All throughout life, we make a distinction between designed things and undesigned things by these 2 basic factors. Would this likely happen on its own without anyone being behind it? And does it conform to some design or function? Or not design. Does it conform to some pattern or function, some purpose? So we find basic stone tools that are just chipped rocks. Well, rocks get chipped on their own all the time. But when those rock chips put it into the exact shape that would fit in a human hand and work for carving or chopping or things, we're able to look at that and say, no, someone made this because it meets the 2 criteria. Or if I find a paper-like substance, I might find sort of stains and marks and things all over it that just happen naturally. But I can tell the difference between that and an alphabet, even if I can't read the alphabet that it's written in and I have no idea what it says. When you guys have probably experienced here in Arizona, hiking through the woods and coming across a rock that has scratches on it that are in the exact shape of local wildlife. And we know that's a petroglyph. We know some person at some point carved that into the rock, maybe hundreds of years ago. And there it is. In fact, that picture up there on the bottom right, I took on a trail outside of Flagstaff. And we know that is man-made. It's designed. Why? Because that shape is unlikely to happen on its own, and it matches up with things that a person would see and draw a picture of around there. And so we detect design in this way all the time. Now, the point is, when we look at living things, we see something extraordinary, unlikely to happen on its own that does conform to a pattern and perform a function. It's no surprise that people all over the world look at it and say, design. It passed the filter. And even the people who deny design have to admit, but it sure does look like it. But at what point do you have to say, if all the qualities of design are there, then it is designed, even if we have trouble explaining or discovering the designer? Asa Gray was a contemporary of Darwin's, in fact, a good friend of Charles Darwin, an American botanist. He was a professing Christian, but accepted most of Darwin's theory. And yet he said this when it came to the atheistic conclusions of that. He said, Mr. Darwin uses expressions which imply that natural forms, which surround us, because they have a history of natural sequences, could have only been generally, but not particularly designed. A view at once superficial and contradictory. Whereas his true line should be that his hypothesis concerns the order and not the cause, the how and not the why of the phenomena, and so leaves the question of design just where it was before. Well, that's a big wordy way of saying what? What he's saying is, when you look at it and you see all the evidence of design in something, if someone says, yeah, but it took a lot of steps for that shape to get there. Okay, well, then the designer took a long time. The design is still there. So once again, the point is that even if we grant for the sake of argument that Darwinism is true, not only does it not remove the order of the cosmos and the purposeful placement of all the things therein, it does not remove the information rich on every level of living things, but it also doesn't remove the evidence of design itself that we find in those things. And so what it turns out is that, unlike what Darwin and Dawkins thought, the theory of evolution is not the escape hatch they believed it was. Romans 1 still applies even in their world. The evidence of God is all around them. They are without excuse. But did Darwinian evolution really happen? It's time to stop for the sake of argument and get into this conversation. Is that an accurate history of how living things got to be the way they are? And I'm going to contend that it's not. But I remind you, if you're here and you do think that the Darwinian narrative is roughly accurate, and I can't persuade you otherwise, remember the first half of this talk. All the evidence, even in your world, points back to the existence of this ultimate mind, this one singular God behind all of creation. You still have to reckon with that fact. But that said, let's look at why I think that it is not the case that Darwinian evolution occurred at all in the sense of a single organism giving rise to everything, man descending from the beasts and the like. As a Christian, I will admit my presuppositions here. I believe that God has not only ordered this world, he has spoken to it. He has revealed himself and revealed what he has done and why he has done it. We don't just see that there's a purpose and function. We can know the purpose and function because God has made himself known. And he, through the prophets and apostles of old, has said again and again that he made man from the dust of the earth as a special creation separate from the beasts, made in his image, and very much follows from that. And I can't write off the drumbeat again and again throughout the Bible of that reality as a mere metaphor or allegory. It's stated too many times to make too many points, always as part of literal history, with lessons drawn directly from it that would require it to be the true origin of man. But with that said, when I look out into the world, I also find the evidence for Darwinian evolution to be lacking, and the evidence against it and for a more direct intervention of the creator, the designer, to be far more compelling. So let's run through that quickly as we continue in our time here. So what's the evidence for evolution? I could give an entire lecture just on this, responding point by point. I've done so in the past, but for today's time, we're going to focus on general categories, and then I'll circle back in my next talk with some more specific examples that we'll hang out on in more detail, specifically related to us. But in general, the evidence for evolution offered is homology and genetic similarity, and we can stick these two together because they're just the big and the little version of the same argument. Homology is just lots of living things have very similar parts. And they have very similar parts in ways that don't seem to need to be that way. So if you look at a bat's wing and a whale's flipper and a man's arm and a frog's leg, and they all have the same bones in them, just different lengths and slight arrangements, but are basically the same limb reused over and over again in different shapes. Doesn't that show that they came from a common ancestor? Well, it's consistent with that, but does it prove it? Not at all. In the same way, genetic similarity is the same thing on the microscopic level. How come so many organisms use the same genetic code, very, very similar genetic code, in the same order, the same sequence, to do all kinds of different things? Well, it would seem like they inherited that code. But there are other ways to look at this. None of this is new observation. People for hundreds of years, thousands of years, have noticed the similarities in various things and never felt like everything had to be related to each other for it to be true. In fact, believe it or not, William Paley, who we mentioned earlier, uses all these similarities as an argument in favor of God and against natural theories. Because he points out, let's use an example from our own experience. Anyone here like art? Paintings? How about music? Music? Yeah. So you think about your favorite artist, whether they're a visual artist, a painter that you might go to a museum and see, or an artist you might listen to on the radio or on Spotify. If they have a new song that comes out and it pops up, do you recognize pretty quick that it's them, even though you have never heard the song before and you didn't see the name written on it yet? Do you immediately realize, oh yeah, that's by my favorite artist? I know tons of people who can walk through a museum and without looking at the nameplates, just be able to go, yeah, that's a Monet. That's a Dali. That's a Da Vinci. That's a Van Gogh. How do they do it? Because these artists have a style where they reuse the same themes, the same basic ideas in various ways. And so if you're looking at Van Gogh's Starry Night, or you're looking at his paintings of sunflowers, they're very different paintings, but you can tell that's a Van Gogh. Well, when you walk outside and you look at bird, fish, frog, porpoise, or man, you can look and say, yeah, that's a god. I know the artist. He does this all the time. That's the way he likes to put the bones in the limbs. That's the code he likes to use when he writes their genetic instructions. We see these reused themes, even to do very different things, and we recognize the work of a common mind behind it. Now, vestigial organs and pseudogenes, this is when we look at, say, your body, you might find organs in there that do something in other animal bodies and don't do the same thing in your body, like the appendix. We'll talk more about that one later. And you're like, okay, I have an appendix and the sheep has an appendix, but its appendix is part of its digestive system and mine doesn't help with digesting anything. You get mine infected, I can cut it out and my life doesn't seem to change at all. And so the evolutionist says that's a vestigial organ. It's an organ from your evolutionary past that you don't need anymore, but you're still born with it because your ancestor had it. And so it doesn't just vanish. And so it doesn't do anything for you anymore, but it's proof that you come from a creature that did need it. Well, the problem we'll see later when we talk more detail about it is that the appendix actually does stuff. It just does something different for us than it does for the other animals. And that's the point, really. And pseudogenes are the same thing on the genetic level. Hey, this gene does something for this animal. You have the same gene, but it's broken. It doesn't do anything. Or maybe it does, and we haven't discovered what yet. That there are plenty of things that we find in bodies that do one thing in one animal and a different thing in another animal. And for us, we don't know what it does. But maybe it does something very important we haven't yet discovered. But also, let's say it is broken. The Bible teaches us to believe in a fall. We believe that there are things in our body, in our form, in our lives, even in our souls that are broken, that we need to be born again. We need to be recreated. And so the fact that different bodies of creatures sometimes have broken, useless things does not surprise me from a biblical worldview. It does not demand a Darwinian origin. Finally, dysteleology is basically the argument of that's a bad design. Sure, it looks designed, but it looks incompetently designed. I could do better, which is a nice thing to say when you don't have to actually create anything to back it up. The truth is, we may not fully comprehend the purposes behind why God made things the way he did, but that doesn't mean that it's not designed. So, ultimately, these objections are all theological, not scientific. They all come down to God wouldn't do it that way. I can imagine it being better. Wouldn't God be wiser than me? Wouldn't a God who doesn't have to keep meddling in his creation be a greater God? Wouldn't we really expect everything to just happen by natural processes so God doesn't have to keep being involved? Maybe he wants to be involved. Why is there so much suffering in the world? And believe it or not, I see this argument in a ton of evolutionary literature. Why is there so much pain in human childbirth? Have you read Genesis? The point is, these arguments all come down to it must be evolution because God wouldn't do it that way. We pretend to read the mind of God. But instead, let's look at what evolution fails to explain. First of all, when we actually look at how natural selection works, it's a real thing. It's true that an animal's going to have different colored offspring with different lengths of hair, with different defects, different things are going to come out. And the ones that are most fit for the environment are going to survive and the others are going to die off. That's a basically true observation. And it's logical. But can it explain the massive amount of change it would take to go from a single-celled organism to all the complexity of life? No. Microbiologist Michael Behe observes Darwinian evolution is self-limiting. The same factors that make it work well on a small scale ensure that it doesn't go very far. And the reason is it's simply reacting to the environment in a completely blind way, which means it can't build in steps over time. And the main reason for that is because breaking things will always be faster than building things. Let's say we're trapped. It's getting hot out here now, right? We're coming into summer. I'm trapped out in the Arizona desert, and I've got one tank of gas to get back to the city, or I die. What am I going to do to make sure that I make it back on that one tank of gas? And let's say I know nothing about cars. I'm a blind mechanic. Am I going to go in and tinker with the engine and hope that I can make some random change that will give me a fuel-efficient engine and allow me to get back more effectively? That's a bad idea. That's a bad idea. What am I going to do instead? What are you going to start doing to make sure your car's more fuel efficient? Throw stuff out. Throw stuff out. I'm getting rid of the spare tire. I'm yanking the extra seats out. I'm dumping everything I can in the desert to make this lighter so it takes less gas for me to get back so that I can get back in this one tank of gas. But you might need the spare tire later. Evolution doesn't care what you need later. Natural selection is based on what helps you survive right now. And that will always be, in the short run, the fastest strategy to adapting to your environment will be ditching things, breaking things. And that's exactly what we see. When there's a change in the environment and animals change to react to it, it's by breaking existing genes. Long hair becomes short hair or no hair. An antibiotic is killing off the bacteria. And so a bacteria that is less effective at absorbing that antibiotic because something's wrong with it will survive when normally it would have died in a healthy environment. And so it becomes antibiotic resistant, not by building a new system to fight antibiotics, but by breaking an old system that the antibiotic was attacking in the first place. Does that make sense? So the same thing that makes natural selection so effective at adapting on small scale to your environment makes it a terrible solution to building whole new things. What's more, Behe also examined that life is filled with a certain type of complexity that he named irreducible complexity. Now, this doesn't mean that something is so complex it couldn't possibly evolve. What it means is it's complex in a very specific kind of way. It's made up of a group of parts that all have to be there and in exactly their position. And if you remove any one of them, it won't work. And his simple example is the mousetrap. That's not a high-tech device. It's a pretty low-tech device. And yet, of its small number of parts, if you remove any one of them, you don't have a less effective mousetrap. You have a pile of junk. And so you can't build a mousetrap slowly, step by step, by gaining one part at a time and slowly arranging them into the position they need to be as it becomes slowly more and more effective. That's what evolution needs to happen. But we have so many systems in our bodies, in the bodies of bacteria, in the bodies of fungi and plants and animals that all have to be fully developed and in their exact place, or they don't work at all. Biology is filled with irreducible complexity that does not allow step-by-step development. What's more, the fossil record. The fossil record doesn't show gradual development on the large scale of different body types. Sure, you can see variation within specific kinds of creatures in the fossil record over time, absolutely. I don't deny that at all. What you don't see is entirely new types slowly developing from old types gradually. In fact, Darwin knew about this. It's in his book on the origin of species, and he acknowledges it as one of the greatest arguments against his theory. His assumption was that the fossil record was just woefully incomplete. The problem is the more that we've studied it, we find situations where fossils are preserved all the way around the world, showing that we know exactly what stuff was around when that layer of rock was formed. We have a complete picture. The fossils don't vary, but what we see is them bursting onto the scene fully developed and then either going extinct or staying basically the same type of creature, never gradually developing to something else. You just suddenly see something else burst in fully developed. And so the fossils here are from what's called the Cambrian explosion, one of the most famous examples of this in the fossil record. So one argument they might give is that, well, fossils are just so hard to form. Of course we're missing fossils. But again, the whole world is wrapped in the same layer filled with these fossils. Now, if you want to say, well, what happened was there was this one really rare event. In fact, it was a one-time event that went around the whole world and buried a whole bunch of stuff at once and gave us a special fossil record we otherwise wouldn't have had. All right, I'm with you there. But that's not where they want to go with it. We'll talk about that tomorrow if you want to come back tomorrow morning. We'll have that conversation. But the point is, the fossil record is not consistent with gradual Darwinian progression from a single common ancestor. It doesn't fit it. Here is my favorite example, though. That's the last argument I'll present, and then we'll wrap this talk up, take a break. So here we have that nature is filled with gratuitous beauty. Now, this is not me saying that everything in nature is beautiful. In fact, if everything was beautiful, nothing would be. Have you ever noticed when you walk into an art museum that beautiful paintings are hung on very plain walls? Because beauty only works if it has a background of things that aren't the same beautiful. And so the claim is not that God made everything beautiful, but the claim is that when we look around the world, it is filled with incredibly beautiful things that are far more beautiful than they need to be. There's no survival benefit that would explain how it got to be that way. Nor is there, by the way, any survival benefit in us noticing it. Isn't that something weird about humans? Do you really think a deer is walking out in the woods and goes, "Oh, a squirrel"? But we do. We stop, "Oh, look at the bunny." Hawks notice the bunny, but for very different reasons. There is this beauty, and we have the capacity to see it. And it's incredible, and it enriches our lives. But ask yourself, does the bright red parrot in the jungle survive better than if he blended in with the trees? No. He's going to get eaten. Jaguar's going to grab him. So why is he so bright and red? Well, they'll say, well, it's because the females are attracted to the bright colors, and so therefore they have more kids, and that's why you have the bright red parrot. But why? Wouldn't females that are attracted to males that are better equipped for survival have more kids than females that are attracted to males that have a whole buildup set up to get them eaten? And how do you explain flowers this way? Are they trying to attract the eyes of the other plants? They say, no, it's attracting the eyes of the bugs. The bugs, they see the beautiful colors and they know that's where the food is. Yeah? How? How do they know that food's in the colorful flowers? Well, they've learned that flowers are where food is, and flowers are colorful. But hold on, why are the flowers colorful? Because the bugs like the color. Why do the bugs like the color? Because that's where the food is. How do they know that's where the food is? Because that's what flowers are. But isn't that what? It's a chicken and the egg. It's a cycle. To have colorful flowers, the bugs need to already like the color, but the only reason they like the color is because flowers are colorful. This doesn't work. The beauty is there, and we don't know why. Here's the other thing, though. When we start to try to chalk all beauty up to mere survival benefit, it robs us of something that makes life worth living. If you read Darwin's autobiography, there's a tragic portion near the end of the book where he describes how he used to love music and art. And now, years as he's developed his theory and changed the way he views the world, he lost all joy in the beautiful things in life. He couldn't appreciate them anymore. There's a cost. There's a cost to denying what our own eyes can see and ears can hear. But don't be fooled. This world is filled with spectacular beauty, and it is there to be enjoyed, and seemingly for no other reason than that it pleases. In fact, when the Garden of Eden was first created, what are we told? God chose for mankind the plants not only that were useful for food, it wasn't purely utilitarian, but that were also what? Pleasant to the eye. God wanted us to have and appreciate beauty. He gave that to us. And the thing is, even my atheist friends are typically thankful for that. And I think they mean it. I think they really are. I remember one time I was talking to a guy on the street, professed atheist. We weren't getting anywhere. And then I just kind of sidetracked as I looked over and the sunset was setting over the Wasatch Mountains in Utah. And we had this spectacular sunset going on. And as I'm looking at it, I'm like, man, I am so thankful for this. He's like, yeah, me too. Like, I believe you. Who are you thankful to? He's like, no, don't be like that. I'm not thankful to anyone. I'm just thankful. I'm like, hold on. Let me push back a little. That's like saying, I'm not helpful to anyone. I'm just helpful. The verb thankful implies an object. Down in your soul, you know something that your mind has not yet accepted. There is someone to be thankful to for this. And you are. You are thankful, and you should be. God has given us this great gift. So I'll close out with this thought from Bible translator J.B. Phillips, who said, if it is true that there is someone in charge of the whole mystery of life and death, we can hardly expect to escape a sense of futility and frustration until we begin to see what he is like and what his purposes are. If we look around us in the post-Darwinian age, I think we can agree that frustration and futility are a pretty good description of where a lot of us find ourselves. But there is comfort. There is a better way. As Augustine wrote back in the 5th century AD, you awaken us, O Lord, to delight in your praise because you made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Don't miss that. All right, guys, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much. Thank you so much, not only for creating, making yourself known in this amazing, spectacular, beautiful world that you have engineered and decorated like an artist and given us eyes to see and minds to understand and hearts to wonder at, but that you have written yourself into that world so that we can see the evidence of your presence. And you want us to, because you want us to know you and draw close to you and relate to you. God, please help every person in this room, myself included, walk away from here today knowing you a bit more and finding in you the true beauty that we are searching for. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.